Shalom, and welcome to Episode 2 of the Great Tribulation, Pillar, Fire, and Cloud. I'm your host, Marshall Masters, publisher of Jesus and the Third Temple, and this 13-part series is made possible by Your Own World Books and features author Robert Reiland. And now we begin with the first part of Episode 2, Pillar, Fire, and Cloud. Well, Bob, here we are in our second episode in the series titled Pillar, Fire, and Cloud. One of the questions that I often hear thrown by atheists is, has anyone ever seen God, actually heard him? That's their knockdown. They're saying everyone's just hearing something in their ears or in their minds.
I've heard the same question.
Okay. So how does that connect us with the topic of this episode, which is Pillar, Fire, and Cloud?
Actually, God has been seen, but it was not in his natural form. He shrouded himself in a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, and which was called the divine presence, or in Hebrew, the Shekinah.
Okay.
And it first appeared to Moses when he was confronted by this bush that was on fire, but it wasn't burning.
Mm-hmm.
And he asked, "Who are you?" And "I am that I am," answered.
That only proves one thing. Jews always answer a question with a question. So now what we have with the pillar, fire, and the cloud is this brings us really all the way forward to the Second Temple. Now, there was a warning from Jeremiah, as I recall, that the temple was going to fall. Whatever happened with that warning?
That was Solomon's temple. They threw rocks at him and shot arrows at him. They did not want to hear this. He tried to tell them that this is God's will.
Mm-hmm.
This Nebuchadnezzar guy has been commissioned by God to punish us for our falling back. And he's going to come here. And if we resist against him, he'll destroy the whole city and the temple and everything. So back off. But they wouldn't do it. They kept fighting Nebuchadnezzar, and sure enough, just like he said, they destroyed the whole city, the temple, everything, flattened the whole place.
Okay. So now connect the dots. We've got Jeremiah warning about this, and that brings us to the 8th of Nisan, at around the time of the Second Temple.
Right.
What happened on the 8th of Nisan?
Well, at midnight, this was the year of the rebellion, of course, 66.
Mm-hmm.
At midnight, the east gate opened by themselves. They were about 40 feet wide and 60 feet high, and it took 20 men to open them, 20 big bruisers. And normally the noise that it made, because they didn't have lubricated hinges, the noise could be heard about 4 miles distance.
Mm-hmm.
But they had to go and wake up the captain of the guard. He didn't hear any noise, so the gates must have opened silently.
Okay. So?
And the next thing that happened, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the priesthood were preparing everything, and they saw this brilliant light come out from behind the veil of the Holy of Holies. And it was spoken with a voice that sounded like what they described as a waterfall. And it said, "Farewell, my holy house. Goodbye, my palace." And it was weeping at the time. And it went out the front door of the temple and went up on the portico that was at the entrance and sat there until Pentecost, which was about 50 days or so later, because it wasn't quite Passover yet.
Mm-hmm.
And then he came down and went back into the temple as if to see it one more time. and say farewell again. And the same procedure, he wept going along the walls, and he said, "Let us depart hence," and went out straight through the door, straight east through the east gate, and over to the Mount of Olives summit, and sat there for 3.5 years. And the word sat is the same one that they use for sitting Shiva. And he pleaded with the people, "Return unto me, and I will return unto you." But we would not. And so just before Titus began his siege, which would have been about the time of Hanukkah, we don't have an exact date on that. But at that time, he ascended into heaven again with a bat kol, which is a female voice. All of this speaking was the female voice, which is bat kol means daughter of a voice. And he ascended into heaven and said, "I will go back to my place." And he was gone. That was the last public appearance of Almighty God, the Father, on earth. And this happened just as prophesied by the prophet Ezekiel.
What about this story is important for you in particular?
Well, it has to be important because of his God's last public appearance on earth. And he left in somewhat upset circumstances, saying, "Okay, you guys, I'm out of here. You've trashed my laws and you haven't been obedient and you act as though I don't exist, so I'm going away." And if you look into the scripture that goes with that verse that he quoted, "I will go back to my place," it says that I will smite thee, I will bruise thee for 2 days. But on the third day I will raise thee up, and you'll dwell with me forever, which is an encouraging note that goes with that. And surely you would agree the Jewish people have been being bruised for the last 2 days, each day being 1,000 Jewish years.
That's definitely an understatement.
Right, exactly.
So, was this instrumental, though, in you actually writing your book, Jesus in the Third Temple? Is this something that resonated with you this last time that God was known to be here in the temple on earth?
It really lit me off because there are a number of stories about when God left the temple. The first most popular story you hear among Protestants is that, "Oh, he left when the veil was rent in twain." Oh, yeah? Where does it say that? Well, it doesn't, but we've always taught it that way.
That's the old dogma line. Okay.
Duh. And if you go to some of the liberal churches, they'll say, "Well, I suppose he just kind of just drifted away or sneaked out and left." God sneaked out? Come on.
Now, you told me that he opens this gate,
Right,
which should have been heard for miles around.
right.
Okay.
Silently.
Silently. So if you're going to say, well, he kind of just sneaked out, what, God had a can of WD-40?
I say the liberal churches
Uh-huh.
have that story. They don't know the real story.
They don't know the real story.
Hardly anyone knows the real story.
So basically what they've got is the WD-40 version of the story.
Well, they don't really care much about it. And some of them even say, "Well, I don't know. We never thought much about that.
Why is that?
It's a Jewish thing anyway."
Oh, it's a Jewish thing.
Yeah,
It's of no interest.
right. The Old Testament is just a book of Jewish history. The only thing that matters is now the New Testament. That's what you get from those people.
At this point, if they're saying it's a Jewish thing, and at the same time they're praying to a Jew, I don't understand the disconnect.
Yeah, hard to figure.
Yeah.
Well, some people will argue with Jesus is a Jew. He's a Christian. He was the first Christian. That's one thing you'll hear. But they haven't read the entire Bible because when he comes back, once again, he's going to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles with all nations.
So then Jesus was a Jew.
Yeah, definitely.
So when did Christian come into it?
They were invented probably not until 2nd century. Paul was a Jew when he was executed in Rome. James was a Jew when the Jewish hierarchy threw him off of the pinnacle of the temple. Peter was a Jew. They were all Jews. In fact, in a couple of the books of the New Testament and the Gospel, in the very last sentence, it says, "And so they went to the temple and worshipped every day." And this was after the ascension. I mean, they were still Jewish. But Christians came up one after the Gentiles started emerging into the picture.
Okay.
James was martyred in 62. We believe that Paul was executed about 63.
Okay.
And after that, people took off. The people who had really were alert got out of Palestine.
They bugged out.
Yes.
But you've already told me that Christian churches really want to ignore this quote-unquote Jewish stuff. Is that to say Christians are above the law that was established by God? Or should they know it and follow it? And if so, do they have some sort of exclusion somewhere that Jews have, but they don't?
They are absolved from following the Levitical law. They still are bound to the Noahic covenant, the laws of decency, as we would say, but they don't have to refrain from meats that are not kosher. They don't have to attend Passover and the tabernacles and go through all of those Levitical laws. Jesus fulfilled all of those laws for them, and he fulfilled them for the Jewish people also, but God has chosen to deal with his chosen people in a different way. And I cannot judge him, or I cannot even understand it, and neither can anyone else. He'll explain it to us when we see him.
Okay, but the question still stands. Should Christians know the law?
Yeah.
Whether they're exempt from it or not.
Right. They should know it, even though they're exempt from it.
And why?
Because Jesus fulfilled it for them. Shouldn't they at least be curious as to how he did it, where he did it, and when he did it? One, for example, is when he was born, he was not born on the 25th of December. He was born on Rosh Hashanah.
Okay.
And the way you can find this out is by reading the Haftorah.
And Rosh Hashanah is when?
That's time of autumn during the Teshuvah.
Mm-hmm.
It tells it because the Haftorah that's read at that time is that 61 chapter of Isaiah that was given to him to read when he was in the synagogue, Kfar Nahum, as they pronounce it. You could hurt yourself saying that. And that was given to special people they wanted to honor. If it's somebody's birthday, they still do it today. They ask them to read a portion from the Haftorah. If you went to synagogue and it was your anniversary, and if you made this known to the rabbi, they might ask you and invite you to read the Haftorah for that service.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's kind of a nice custom myself.
Yeah, it is. Well, Christians should know the law, but they're not compelled to follow the law. My next question is, if the Christians are getting all this slack, and I don't know who passed this on to them, you haven't mentioned that part of it.
Yeshua did.
Yeshua, okay. But did he cut anybody else a little slack, or did they get a little juice? How about the temple priests? You said there are so many of them. Did they get a little juice, some special favors? Let's talk about that in the next segment.
All right.
To learn more about Jesus and the Third Temple by Robert Reiland, please visit JesusandTheThirdTemple.com. And now we continue with the second part of Episode 2, Pillar, Fire, and Cloud. Well, Bob, in the last segment, we were talking about everybody seems to get a special deal. Now let's turn our focus on temple priests, because temple priests, to me, are like anybody else that is a gatekeeper function. So, did the priests of the temple get a sweetheart deal?
Some of them were outstanding and beloved, just like some of our popes and ministers like Billy Graham. But probably the most remarkable high priest was Simeon the Righteous.
Okay.
And he was in office for 40 years, which is quite remarkable, but just wait a little bit later.
Yeah.
He was so respected and so admired through the whole world, not within Judaism, that Alexander was on his way toward Judah. He had just finished off Tyre, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And Simeon heard that he was on his way, and he wanted to show him that we were going to be peaceful. The Jewish people are well governed within their own system. They'll cooperate with you, and we're not going to have any fighting, okay? So he went to meet Alexander. They met right near Antioch, and Alexander dismounted from his carriage and went over and bowed before Simeon.
Wow.
Yes, wow. That's how much respect this man generated throughout the world at that time. During his reign, there were several miracles in the temple that are just fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
When they brought 2 he-goats before the priest, every year the lot piece for the Lord, which was the one that was going to be slain, came up in Simeon's right hand every year.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a crimson strap that they tied between the horns and under the throat of the scapegoat, the Azazel.
Mm-hmm.
Azazel was led out by one of the priests out into the wilderness, away from carrying Israel's sins into the wilderness. The crimson strap was tied to one of the gates of the temple, and whenever they reached the wilderness, that crimson strap would turn white as snow, just like that. During those times, there were only 2 logs were allowed for the burning of the sacrifices on the altar of sacrifice in front of the temple. And during the time of Simeon, those 2 logs lasted for all day. That was a miracle.
Mm-hmm.
The one that's most fascinating to me is the westernmost candle of the menorah. It was always lighted first. All of the candlesticks were filled to the same level with oil. And that one being closest to the Holy of Holies, therefore being the closest to the Shekinah behind the veil,
Mm-hmm.
the others were lighted off of its flame. And yet, during the time of Simeon, always the westernmost candle outlasted all of the other candles.
Mm-hmm.
Last one to burn out.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very encouraging sign to all of Israel and to the priests. And I mentioned that there's another priest who was of high respect, and he was Yohanan Hyrcanus. His reign was 80 years. He was also highly respected and regarded, but not as much so as Simeon. Simeon is much more famous because of the miracles, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to the appearance of the Shekinah, he only appeared to the Jewish people. No Gentiles, including Christians, are permitted in the temple, not even in the court.
Okay.
Talking about getting a little slack.
Yeah, but would that hold today? In other words, same circumstances. You got a Jew and you got a Christian standing in the same room in the temple, and God appears. Are both going to see or not?
The next time Shekinah appears will be when Messiah arrives, and Shekinah will be accompanying him with all the saints. And the saints are the believers, the people who are now dead, but they will be raised up. Their souls will approach the world with Messiah and Shekinah, and he will take over the world at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that time, the Jewish people, Gentiles, anybody, well, everybody, every knee shall bow. Everyone will see him. Every tongue confess that he is Lord.
Okay.
It's going to be a big day.
So back in those times, only Jews could see him, Gentiles couldn't.
Right.
But now Gentiles can.
Well, the Gentiles will.
Gentiles will.
Shekinah is not present right now.
Did they earn it? Or is it a freebie?
Only Christians and inscribed Jews receive a special deal because they love the Lord. The inscribed Jews still are bound to the law, but Christians are exempt from the law because Yeshua Yosef fulfilled it for them. Inscribed Jews await their Messiah and Redeemer with joyful expectation. All others are rejected because they rejected him. Jewish and Christian believers still receive earthly punishment, but are forgiven their sins in order to be permitted to dwell eternally with a perfect God in the New Jerusalem. Jewish people are God's chosen people.
No, I'm talking about the Gentiles.
Oh, what about them?
All right, you're saying this time they're going to be able to see?
Oh, well, everybody will see him.
Everybody will see. So
Yeah.
everybody, as in including Muslims and Buddhists and atheists and agnostics,
Right.
everybody?
Everybody who is present and has survived the tribulation on earth at that time when Yeshua returns will see him, and they'll see the Shekinah also. Saints will return in their perfect, glorified spiritual bodies, same as Yeshua Yosef when he was resurrected, able to walk through walls, appear anywhere, anytime, and so forth.
Okay.
It's going to be a big day.
That'll be a big day.
He will defeat all of the armies that are surrounding Jerusalem at that time with one word, just like that. And the blood will be up to the horses' bridles in the Kidron Valley. That's like about 5 feet deep. Not a pretty story.
Okay.
Yet it is a very fulfilling story.
You know, the question I'm still not sure if we got it is simply, did God show special favors to the priests? Any of the priests?
Yes. The priests that I know of are Simeon and Johann Hyrcanus.
Okay.
Only Christians and inscribed Jews receive a special deal because they love the Lord. The inscribed Jews still are bound to the law, but Christians are exempt from the law because Yeshua Yosef fulfilled it for them. Inscribed Jews await their Messiah and Redeemer with joyful expectation. All others are rejected because they rejected him. Jewish and Christian believers still receive earthly punishment, but are forgiven their sins in order to be permitted to dwell eternally with a perfect God in the New Jerusalem. There may have been others, but I haven't read of them. I don't know how special Simeon was, except that by the dates I can speculate that this was right after the Maccabees kicked Greeks out of the temple. I took back the temple for Judaism, and apparently everybody was being really obedient and worshipful and so forth, and he was leading them, and God had probably chosen him to lead them, and therefore God rewarded him with all this adoration and miracles and so forth. But I can only speculate that. I haven't been able to find out why it happened to him specifically. But I do know that, according to the calendar, that this was right after the Maccabees. Right after the retrieval of the temple.
Got it. What I'm hearing in my mind is that a Jewish bricklayer has got more to deal with to understand than the priests in his temples or the rabbis today, and certainly cannot compare with the free ride that Christianity gets, along with Buddhism and Hindus and Muslims and everyone else.
Beginning at that time, all will be under one faith, worshiping God under Yeshua Yosef.
So I'm still trying to understand why everybody's getting sweetheart deals except the poor Jew. So I'm still working on that. Excuse me for being a poor little guy here, but the poor little guys keep getting it up to tuchus. Work this out for me, Bob.
Again, Only Christians and inscribed Jews are forgiven of their sins because they love and cherish the love of Messiah, because he paid for their sins on the cross. Jewish people are always saying, why didn't he choose somebody else for a while? Enough already.
Oh, boy, I can see why.
Well, God chose the Jewish people, above all nations. That statement is in the Torah about 33 times. As if you didn't get it the first time, I want you to hear it.
33 times?
As a result of that, he expects more from his chosen people than he does from us other schmucks that aren't Jewish. And he wants them to be closer to him. It's sort of like in a family. You've seen this, maybe, I know I have, where one child in a big family of, say, 8 kids, one kid is daddy's favorite.
Oh, yeah.
But they all know that, and because they love their father, they honor her or him also. And they get away with more. But they get punished more severely if they goof off. And it's sort of like that with the Jewish people among the other nations. But going on from there, there was murmuring with Moses.
Well, before we go on from there, the favorite one gets punished a little harder.
Yeah.
Usually the favorite one is the youngest in the family. But the eldest can be a favorite, or they could just be the one that the parents made all their mistakes with. That's what I'm grappling with here. I'm not seeing fairness in it. I'm seeing some people that are getting stuck to a higher bar.
It isn't fair. No, that's not what it's about. It's about special love. I have 36 first cousins. That means I have a lot of aunts and uncles. And I remember one of those uncles particularly, his favorite, and everybody knew it, was Carolyn, the middle kid of the family. She could do no wrong. She was probably the prettiest of all of them. He called her Kelly. He had a special name for her. Hardly anybody else called her that. But she wasn't the last one born, and she wasn't the first born. She was special, and she was his chosen, and there was no question about it.
Okay, some people get it easy. Some people just don't get it so easy. But there was a historian that I was listening to, and he made a very cogent observation. He said, if you want to know what a Roman temple, this was before Christianity, what a Roman temple looked like, walk into a Catholic church and change out the statuary. It all looks the same.
Right.
The design of the church, that's how the temples were designed in ancient Rome. So that really gets me to a question. Do Christians think the temple was a church? And let's answer that in the next segment. To learn more about Jesus and the Third Temple by Robert Reiland, please visit JesusandTheThirdTemple.com. And now we continue with the third and final part of Episode 2, Pillar, Fire, and Cloud. Okay, Bob, as we left the last segment, there was a question in my mind. That is, do Christians think the temple was a church?
That question has really confused a lot of Protestants and maybe even Jewish people. The Jewish people say, oh, we're going to Temple Israel, Temple Emmanuel. What they're talking about is a synagogue. Very few people, unfortunately, know anything about the Holy Temple of Jerusalem, which was designed by God. It was first designed as the tabernacle, and then later on, of course, Solomon designed it as a building instead of a tent, and it was blessed by God in most wonderful ways, spectacular ways. But Christian people and possibly many Jewish people are confused by that term, temple. Do me a favor here for the listeners. Give us a brief description of the temple layout. You could kind of think of the temple as a park and it has courts in the front of it and a main building. You approach the temple on a broad expanse, and the first gate you come to is the Gate Beautiful, they call it. It doesn't even have a lintel over it or any doors, and that's the entrance to the Court of Women, where women and children can stand, but they cannot leave that court. The main building is called the Heifer, and that is, of course, where the Holy of Holies and the holy place is. And it's about 50 meters long, and the whole temple area is about 158 meters long and about 64 meters wide. There are colonnades over the courts to protect people from the weather sometimes. And it's kind of interesting to note that all turns in the temple were to be to the right, unless you were grieving about something. If you had a mishap or an illness in the family or financial loss, then you could turn to the left. And then people would know that, and they could approach you and maybe sympathize and so forth. There were 13 gates, and the walls of the temple were about 7.5 feet thick. I hope that gives you a little better idea of what the temple looked like. There is, of course, in the book a sketch, a very detailed sketch of the temple, however. By thinking it's like a church where you go in and you sit down. Well, okay, the Orthodox have the men sit on the left and the women sit on the right. And the other lesser conservative churches, synagogues, they just sit wherever. They think that the temple on Jerusalem was like a church. No, 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 no. Nobody was allowed to go in to the Holy of Holies except the high priest. And that was once a year on Yom Kippur, where he would go in carrying the ash censer, and they would even tie a rope to his ankle in case, like, he should die while he's in there. They could drag him out because none of them could go in there. Although
excuse me, that's a curious thought, having a rope tied to your ankle when you're going to go see God. Go on, please.
Although they do have a special provision which Dr. Asher Kaufman used for the people who had to go in and patch the plaster or repair a roof leak or something like that. They do have a special dispensation for workers that go in to study or fix the Holy of Holies and things like that. So it wasn't completely off limits to everybody, but in general terms, it was.
So the temple was a union shop?
Only the priests could go in there, the sons of Levi. Yeah, Yeshua couldn't go in the temple.
But these repairmen that went in to fix in there, there was a special dispensation, eminently practical. But were these workmen specially trained? Did they have to wear a rope around their ankle as well in case they plots dead in the middle of that and then need to be dragged out? I'm interested in this. Tell me more about the workmen.
Very likely they would. I don't know. I haven't seen that in print anywhere, but it makes sense because if someone were to collapse and die or fall or whatever, they had to get them out of there, and they didn't have the sanction to go in there. They'd have to drag them out. Only Levite priests were permitted to enter the holy place.
They would see what's in there. Were they sworn to secrecy if they revealed anything with terrible consequences, or they could just tell anybody what they saw when they went in there to do the work? It's like, hello, I'm patching a little plaster, and what do you know, I'm talking to God. All right?
No secret about what was in there.
No secret?
Oh, in the Solomon's temple, the Ark of the Covenant sat there, and the staves were extended through the rings, and they protruded against the veil. And we've talked about that, and it looked like women's breasts. And the threshing floor, where the ark sat, and we see it when we go up on the Temple Mount now. I could take you there tomorrow. It's under that little innocent-looking dome of the tablets. That's what Asher Kaufman found. The threshing floor in the Holy of Holies. And there was nothing else in there. That's all, folks.
Okay.
Oh, and the ark. oftentimes is shown incorrectly.
Mm-hmm.
The Ark of the Covenant was the only temple article that had its long axis extending north and south.
Mm-hmm.
The candelabra and the table of showbread were extended east and west, but the Ark of the Covenant extended north and south, and that is because nobody sits in front of God. While he's sitting on his mercy seat, he had the cherubim at each of his elbows,
Mm-hmm.
and the staves extended alongside the north and south ends of the ark. A lot of times you'll see the Ark of the Covenant shown just exactly 90 degrees wrong.
Numbers and dimensions are obviously important. That brings me to the question, is God into numerology?
In a very big way. All through the Bible, the number 3 appears just continuously. And I know it's offensive to Jewish people to mention the Trinity, God in 3 persons. But let's look at water is comprised of 3 molecules, 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. And ice is solid, but it's H2O. Water is liquid, but it's H2O. And vapor, steam, is water, H2O. But they're all 3 different, but yet they are one. Now, God's not limited. He can do anything.
Mm-hmm.
But the number 3 appears all through the Bible. There were 3 crosses at Golgotha. Paul was stoned 3 times.
You know, it's funny. We have all these sayings about numbers.
1 is the number of unity. God is 1. 2 is the number of union, man and wife. 3 is God's number for his divinity. The list is almost without end. 4 is the number of the world. 5 is God's number for division. 6 is God's number for mankind. And 7 is God's number for perfection or dispensational fulfillment.
I know in China, the number 8 is really important. It's a lucky number. And then, of course, there's 7. 7 is an interesting number. Let's talk about 7.
7 is God's number for perfection or dispensational fulfillment. 7 days comprise a week. There are 7 branches and 7 candles on the menorah. Jews were required to rest the land following every 7 years. 7 appears in Scripture more times than any other number. Like Jesus told the apostles, you should forgive someone 7 times 70 times. And there are countless others. But let's go to your number 8. That's a good one for Jewish people. 8 is the number of new beginnings. And that is the day when little Jewish boys are circumcised. They begin their boyhood, not their manhood. I know that comes with the bar mitzvah.
Mm-hmm.
But that is the day on which they're circumcised. And there's a very practical reason for that, too. The newborn, it might be a little bit too traumatic to do that surgery. And so this gives them a little bit time to mature. Interesting fact, it must be done in the daytime, according to the law. I think that's a good idea, don't you?
You want to see what you're doing with that. I mean, it's if you've ever been to a bris, I was godfather to a young lad, and I was holding him for the bris and then handed him off to the rabbi. And when the rabbi did the wackola, my knees went out from underneath me.
Boy.
Interestingly enough, I learned a little interesting bit of trivia. Do you know why Judaism is not the dominant religion in the world?
Well,
One question. I gotta cut off the end of my what?
oh.
And it's serious. Think about it. This was in the days before penicillin.
Possibly.
It was a real slowdown there for somebody. Take the charm off the religion for someone who wanted to convert.
I think it's because God selected them at his own number.
Okay.
Now, I'd like to tell you about the numbers 9 and 11. They have great significance.
Okay.
Number 9 is God's number for judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And 11 is his number for chaos. And Tisha B'Av is the day on which Solomon's temple was destroyed. And it's the same day on which the second temple was destroyed. And it's the day all of the Jews were driven out of England. And in 1492, on Tisha B'Av, all the Jews were driven out of Spain. And during the Holocaust, in the camps, the Germans would go to great trouble to prepare feasts, beautiful feasts, for the Jewish inmates, because they knew it was a fast day on Tisha B'Av, and they were not allowed to eat that glorious food placed before them. Now, 9 is his good number for judgment, and 11 is his number for chaos.
Hold on a second. Are we talking 9/11 here?
You're ahead of me.
Hey, that's a change.
That's good. Now we come to 9/11. Speaking of God's numerology, here's something for everyone to think about. Tisha B'Av is the 9th day of the 11th Jewish month.
Mm-hmm.
Is God trying to tell us something? And we know it was a wake-up call. And it's very interesting, I think, that it happened on 9/11.
Some people would call it a coinkydink, but I don't think you would.
The United States is a favored nation, and God deals with us. And I think he dealt with us with that number on that day.
Well, it was a wake-up call, that's for sure.
Right.
Well, one last question I have before we wrap up this episode is, did any other miracles that we haven't discussed already appear in the temple?
Oh, golly, there were a bunch of them.
Okay, just a few.
The wind could be blowing 40 knots,
Mm-hmm.
and the smoke from the altar would go straight up.
Wow.
There was never a fly in the slaughterhouse. Can you imagine that?
No flies in the slaughterhouse?
Never a fly in the slaughterhouse.
Wow.
During the building of both temples, there was no inclement weather that held up construction.
This is curious, because the third temple is going to be built.
Mm-hmm.
If and when the third temple is being constructed, and there's all kinds of inclement weather, is that a harbinger that not such a good idea?
Yeah, very good point, Marshall.
Okay, now I know. When they go to build the third temple, I'm going to check Weather Channel every day.
My favorite miracle was on Yom Kippur. The priest would have to, certain times, utter the ineffable name, YHWH, Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
I am that I am. But some priests were not even allowed to utter that ineffable name. There were only certain priests who were held in that regard, that they were permitted to say it. But anyway, when they said it, or when they were supposed to say it, and may not have been allowed to it, the congregation is standing in the temple courts, and it's standing room only. They're all jammed in there as tight as they can be. And when that name is uttered, they were to lie prostrate on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And they always did.
Wow.
How could they do that? That's remarkable.
Mm.
They're all standing up, crushed up against each other in a standing position, and at certain moments, they lie down flat on the ground. Come on. But that is one of the miracles of the temple, which is most fascinating to me.
Yeah, because otherwise it sounds like it would have been a Chinese fire drill. You know, how do you get 50 college students in a phone booth?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in that event, in our next show, he-goats and scapegoats, I am kind of curious about the Heifer's gangway bridge. Let's get into that in our next episode. Okie doke?
That'll be great. Isn't it strange that a Goy scholar knows all this stuff?
Well, hey, you know more than I do.
Another interesting number is 40, the number of probation or testing. The Exodus was 40 years. Shekinah remained in the temple 40 years after the crucifixion. The Talmud rabbis lament there were no miracles in the temple during 40 years before the temple was destroyed.
There's a lot of interesting history here, and we're going to cover a lot more of it in the next one, he-goats and scapegoats.
You'll love that one.
You betcha. This concludes Episode 2, Pillar, Fire, and Cloud. Next up, please join us for Episode 3, He-Goats and Scapegoats. To learn more about Jesus and the Third Temple by Robert Reiland, please visit JesusandTheThirdTemple.com.